Let me tell you something that Washington does not want you to notice. A few months ago, Donald Trump stood in front of the cameras, that familiar posture, that familiar smirk, and declared with the kind of casual arrogance that has become his political signature that Canada should simply become the 51st state of the United States of America. Not a joke, not a hypothetical, a declaration. He said, and I want you to hear this clearly, we don't need anything Canada has. Read that again. We don't need anything Canada has. This is the man who controls the most powerful economy on Earth, the most advanced military in human history, and the loudest megaphone in global politics. And he looked north at his closest neighbor, his most loyal trading partner, the country that shares nearly 9,000 kilometers of border with the United States, and decided the most strategic move was public humiliation. That was the opening shot, and the entire world watched to see what Ottawa would do. Would Canada fold? Would Prime Minister Mark Carney fly to Washington, hat in hand, and negotiate terms of surrender like a smaller nation accepting the logic of empire? That is what Washington expected. That is what Washington bet on, and that is exactly what did not happen. My name is Evelyn Carter. I study political science at the University of Toronto, and I've spent years watching how power actually moves in international relations, not as it is performed on camera, but as it operates in the numbers, in the supply chains, in the energy flows, and in the quiet decisions made by finance ministers and trade secretaries long before a president ever opens his mouth. What I'm about to show you is not a feel-good story about Canada winning a trade war. It is something more precise and frankly more alarming than that. It is a case study in what happens when a leader with enormous power completely misreads his own vulnerabilities and what the economic wreckage looks like when that miscalculation comes home. Because the story of Trump versus Canada is not just about tariffs and ruffled diplomatic feelings. It is about leverage, about dependency, about the brutal arithmetic of a supply chain that Washington spent decades pretending did not exist. And it ends not with a Canadian surrender, but with something far more interesting. It ends with the most powerful man in the world, quietly, reluctantly, unmistakably backing down. To understand what happened, you need to go back to the beginning of this confrontation, because from the very start, the Trump administration's approach to Canada was not strategic. It was theatrical. It followed a pattern that anyone who has watched this administration long enough will recognize immediately. Step 1. Identify a target. Step 2. Apply maximum rhetorical pressure. Step 3. Assume the target will capitulate because the United States is larger, louder, and richer. Step 4. Declare victory. The problem, the catastrophic, expensive, humiliating problem, is that this playbook assumes the opponent has nowhere else to go. With Canada, that assumption was wrong in almost every conceivable direction, but Washington didn't know that yet. Or rather, Washington didn't want to know it. So the threats escalated. Jameson Greer, the United States Trade Representative, stood before the press and placed Canada in the same category as China when describing retaliatory economic actions. Canada, America's largest trading partner. Canada, the country that, as we will get to shortly, supplies 99% of American natural gas imports. Let me say that number out loud one more time because it deserves its own sentence. 99%. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Howard Leddy, the Commerce Secretary, complained with visible indignation that Canada's decision to remove American wines from its retail shelves was, quote, an insult to America. An insult to America. This is the rhetorical environment in which this confrontation took place. Not sober analysis of mutual dependencies, not careful examination of the integrated supply chains that have been built across North America over decades, but grievance performance, status theater, the politics of wounded pride dressed up as economic policy. And this is where I want to say something directly, because it is important. I do not believe Donald Trump is stupid. What I believe is far more dangerous than stupidity. I believe he is a man who has surrounded himself with people who tell him what he wants to hear, who has spent decades operating
in business environments where power could be used as a blunt instrument, and who has genuinely never had to reckon with an opponent that simply refused to be intimidated. Canada refused to be intimidated, and that changed everything. Here is what the American media largely missed in its coverage of this standoff. While Washington was performing strength, Ottawa was building leverage, not loudly, not in press conferences, not in viral social media posts, quietly, methodically, with the kind of patience that marks a country that does not need to perform confidence because it actually possesses it. The first signal came not from a government office, but from ordinary Canadians in grocery stores and supermarkets in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Calgary, in cities and towns across the country. Something happened that no government directive could have manufactured. People simply stopped buying American products. No mandate, no campaign, just a collective decision. Organic, stubborn, and remarkably durable. The Buy Canadian movement exploded. Facebook groups dedicated to the cause swelled to 1.4 million members. Smartphone applications that allowed consumers to scan barcodes and identify American products spread rapidly. People stopped buying American wine. They stopped buying American spirits. They boycotted brands that had American origins with the kind of cheerful, principled stubbornness that Canadians have historically reserved for hockey loyalties, and the numbers that came back from this movement were not subtle. American wine exports to Canada collapsed by 78%. Read that figure carefully. Not a dip, not a correction. A collapse. The value of those exports fell from $460 million down to $13 million. That is a loss of $357 million from a single market in a single boycott wave with no government enforcement required whatsoever. Here is what makes that figure even more striking. That one market, Canada alone, accounted for 81% of America's total global losses in wine exports. Not just losses within North America, total global losses. 81 cents of every dollar lost in American wine exports worldwide came from one country choosing voluntarily to drink something else. The damage did not stop with wine. American spirits took an equally brutal hit. Exports of American liquor to Canada fell by 85% in the second quarter of 2025. The residual value of what remained in that trade was less than $10 million. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, one of the most recognizable American whiskey brands on earth, reported that its Canadian sales fell by 62%. Kentucky whiskey exports to Canada dropped by 50% over the course of 2025 and fell to their lowest level in a decade. And then came the news that made this impossible to dismiss as a statistical blip. Jim Beam announced it was suspending production at its Claremont, Kentucky facility for the entirety of 2026. A Kentucky distillery going dark because Canada stopped buying bourbon. That is not an abstraction. That is workers in Kentucky not going to work. That is a supply chain disruption that radiates outward into the towns and counties that depend on the American spirits industry. That is the kind of economic consequence that eventually, inevitably, finds its way into the offices of congressional representatives who would very much like to keep their seats. And the boycott showed no signs of softening. When pollsters asked Canadians whether they wanted to maintain the boycott or return to buying American products, 73% said they wanted to continue. Only 20% said they wanted to see American goods back on shelves immediately. 73%. This was not a government policy that could be reversed with a phone call. This was a national mood, and moods, once calcified, are extraordinarily difficult to shift. Washington began to feel the pressure. Wine state lobbyists were already marching into congressional offices. Senators from California, New York, and Kentucky were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the administration's trade strategy. A question that nobody in the White House wanted to answer publicly was forming with increasing clarity in the corridors of power. Are we winning this, or are we simply hurting ourselves? But the boycott, as damaging as it was not the center of gravity in this confrontation. The center of gravity was energy. And this is where I want to spend some time, because this is the part of the story that most political commentary skates past far too quickly. And it is the part that actually explains why Washington eventually changed its tone. Let me give you the dependency numbers because they are genuinely remarkable. The United States imports 99% of its natural gas from Canada, 85% of its electricity imports come from Canada, 60% of its crude oil imports originate in Canada. These are not marginal dependencies. These are structural dependencies. They are baked into the infrastructure of the American economy at a level that cannot be quickly or cheaply unwound. The refineries along the Gulf Coast, enormous capital-intensive industrial facilities, were built and optimized specifically to process the heavy crude that comes from Alberta's oil sands. They are not interchangeable. You cannot simply swap in a different grade of oil from a different source without significant operational and financial consequences. And for decades, American refiners have benefited from a pricing advantage that most Americans have never thought about. Canadian heavy crude, known in the industry as Western Canadian Select or WCS, has historically traded at a discount of 14 to 18 per barrel compared to West Texas Intermediate, the American benchmark. This discount exists partly because of geography, partly because of pipeline capacity constraints, and partly because for most of that period Canada had essentially one customer, the United States. When you have one customer, that customer sets the price. For years, that arrangement suited Alberta's energy industry well enough because it still moved product, but it meant that American refiners were getting Canadian oil at a permanent structural markdown that translated into billions of dollars of annual savings. Now, what happens to that discount and to American energy costs when Canada starts building alternative customers? Alberta began developing exactly that. A new pipeline proposal with a capacity of 1 million barrels per day was put forward, with the destination not south toward the Gulf Coast, but west, toward the Pacific, toward China, toward South Korea, toward the growing energy markets of Asia. This, combined with the existing Trans Mountain expansion, which carries between 900,000 and 1 million barrels per day of its own, meant that Canada was positioning itself to redirect up to 1.9 million barrels per day of oil away from American refiners. Do the math on what that means for the $14 to $18 discount. When you are no longer the only buyer, you no longer dictate the price. When you are competing against Asian buyers who are willing to pay market rates, the structural subsidy that American refiners have enjoyed for decades begins to erode, and when the cost of energy rises for American manufacturers, it flows through to American consumers. This was the calculation that started keeping people in Washington's financial circles awake at night. Not the wine, not the bourbon, the oil, the quiet, structural, long-term threat that Canada, patient, methodical, strategically disciplined Canada, was beginning to lay the groundwork to actualize. Then came the moment that reframed the entire confrontation. Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, accepted an invitation to speak at the Economic Club of New York. And what he did there was, in its own quiet way, one of the most strategically sophisticated pieces of political communication I have seen in years. He did not come in anger. He did not come with recriminations or a list of grievances. He did not stand at the podium and enumerate the ways in which the Trump administration had behaved badly. He came with numbers, and he delivered those numbers with the calm, almost glacial composure of a former central banker who has spent his career communicating with people who deal in facts rather than performance. Carney announced a vision for a new Canada, a Canada that was deliberately, systematically repositioning itself in the global economic order. $1 trillion US in targeted investment over 5 years. A tax rate on investment now the lowest in the G7 at roughly half the G7 average and 4 percentage points lower than the United States. 50 million tons of LG exports per year by the end of this decade, with a pathway to doubling that to 100 million tons per year in the following decade. 56 critical mineral agreements signed with more than 10 countries, unlocking over $18 billion in capital. 160 gigawatts of new electricity generation capacity. Canada was not presenting itself as a wounded partner asking for better treatment. Canada was presenting itself as an investment destination, as an energy superpower in formation, as the most attractive place.